Hello, and welcome to Scott's Odyssey. Being that it's the time of the year for ghouls, ghosts, and goblins, I felt it only appropriate to bring you two histories out of our past that haunt people to this day. Both of these stories are true and grounded in facts by witnesses, or at least that's what the local historians tell us. See you in a minute. Welcome back. If you've watched my videos before, thank you for your patronage, and if you're new to Scott's Odyssey, welcome aboard. Our first story hails from a charter member of the Tredyffrin Easttown Historical Society from way back in 1936 named Dr. Anthony Wayne Bach. Dr. Bach's family line in America starts with German Mennonite immigrants whom operated a farm between Howellville and Paoli. I tell you this part of the story because one of the histories recorded is that sometime between September 18th through the 21st of 1777, during a time where there was a British Army encampment in the area, Jacob Bach was suffering a crop loss and extreme damage to his property. It's claimed that his wife was so enraged by the loss and was frying donuts and decided to empty the skillet of hot grease onto the head of a Hessian soldier. In retaliation, the Hessian turned the home inside out, breaking furniture and windows. And then there's this mention, for no apparent reason or furtherment of this particular history, that two Hessian deserters were both shot and buried on that farm. But I believe the mention of the two buried Hessians in relation to oil fats as grease leads to a mythos surrounding the Bach name, where it turns out their family line produced a man who realized adding phosphates to soil actually enriched the soil and thereby created a phosphates chemical plant and changed the manners in which farming is done around the world. But we're not here to tell the story of how soil conservation was invented in Pennsylvania. We're here to continue down this family line to the story of Dr. Anthony Wayne Bach, fifth in the generation line of the American side of the Bach family. Dr. Bach was born on the family homestead in Tredyffrin on May 6th of 1867. Dr. Bach graduated from the Medical College of the University of Pennsylvania in 1892 and interned at St. Joseph's Hospital in Reading. His exceptional abilities as a medical professional were well documented, and he was often talked about by others in his profession. So we could assume that Dr. Bach was quite the scientist and very well grounded in the realities of the mundane things of this world, such as life and sciences. His position and authority gained further acclamation when he worked as the Pennsylvania Railroad surgeon for nearly 20 years. He was a school director and secretary for 2 terms, medical director for several different townships, sergeant at arms at the Republican National Convention, meaning he was the person entrusted to be level-headed enough and affirmative enough to maintain order during the meetings of those involved in the deliberative members in the Republican National Convention. He was also said to have a spectacular memory and a keen sense of humor. That brings us to what Dr. Anthony Wayne Bach is most famously known for and what he will forever be remembered for, attesting to not once, but on multiple occasions. As the story goes, at 10 p.m. on September 20th in 1777, the Battle of Paoli had taken place. Although the Battle of Paoli is its formal name, it's much more often referred to as the Paoli Massacre, or a surprise nighttime attack by the British under the command of Major General Charles Grey, who had his men unload their muskets and remove their flint, and then in this stealthy attack they took the lives of 53 Americans by bayonet. Yes, this is where one would have found General Mad Anthony Wayne's men, and no, Dr. Anthony Wayne Bach is no relation. Because of this attack, General Wayne's division was routed, and a total loss of 272 men was estimated, in which most were taken prisoner. From the British side, Major General Charles Grey became known as No Flint Grey. General Wayne was brought up on charges of misconduct and gross negligence, but was found not guilty of the crime other than a tactical error in judgment, in which Wayne himself demanded he wanted a full court-martial of his actions, which instead saved him from a court-martial and got him hailed for acting with honor. According to the eyewitness accounts, men tried to surrender and were given no quarter. It is recorded that Lieutenant Colonel Adam Hubley of the 10th Pennsylvania Regiment stated, "I with my own eyes see them cut and hack some of our poor men to pieces after they had fallen on their hands and scarcely shew the least mercy to any." Further reports from Major Samuel Hay of the 7th Pennsylvania Regiment states, "The annals of the age cannot produce another such scene of butchery." Other reports claim that the violence of those bayonets and the sabers of the British soldiers were used to literally butcher the people into pieces, slicing off arms, legs, and in some instances even heads. According to recounts only found in the archives of the Tredyffin Easton Historical Society, wink wink, it is claimed that one of the military blues of General Washington's army encamped near to the Paoli was permitted to frequently visit his home and wife, being that he lived close to where the encampment was located, claiming it was permitted because it made one less to feed with the limited rations Wayne's men had. One night, he woke suddenly from a dream. In his dream, his fellow soldiers were being attacked by the British. Going back to sleep after a few minutes, he soon awoke a second time, having again dreamed of the slaughter of his comrades in their camp. Because we all know how, in history, the word comrades is used by people telling real history and not speaking about communism. Anyway, it is claimed he disregarded his wife's protest, dressed himself, and returned to the outpost to find many of the American soldiers lying dead, cut down by the bayonets and sabers of the British. Awestruck, before he could turn away, he too was beheaded by a saber. Which brings us back to the early 1900s and Dr. Anthony Wayne Bach and the legends of the Paoli Massacre. It is said that on the anniversary of the massacre, the colonial rider who was beheaded rides silently from the campsite down through Paoli. The hooves of his mount make no sound, and if one should happen to approach the figure too closely, he will remove his head and hand it to the over-curious spectator. The curse of such an event is that the intruder will surely not live out the year. The only recourse is that any glare of light near the rider will cause him to disappear. On September 22nd of 1932, Dr. Anthony Wayne Bach was taking his normal walk around the town. And along his travels, he claims to have witnessed this ghostly rider, on multiple occasions nonetheless, and even having almost reached the Headless Horseman a time or two. On each time seeing the ghost rider, Dr. Bach took detailed notes of his encounters. The one difference about the silent ghost rider and his interactions with Dr. Bach was that when Dr. Bach approached, he didn't hand him his head, but only vanished. According to the actual newspaper articles, Dr. Bach was the last man to ever see the Paoli Headless Horseman. But curiously enough, the last entry of Dr. Bach seeing the horseman was in September of 1938, just 2 short months before his own passing on November 8th in Paoli. Now, if we travel all the way out to the phenomenal rural area of Millheim, found in Scenic Center County, we have yet another interesting story that comes out of local legends and prominent historical societies, only recently to be redacted because of living figures related to the subject matter, allegedly. Resting in an extremely old and equally small interment park along Route 45 just west of Millheim is the Union Cemetery. It's here that we would hear the story of a man who performed deeds that gained him so much wealth he was speculated to only have been able to accumulate it by being a serial killer, which is quite apt for the restitutions bestowed upon such a murderous fellow, even after his death. With the largest headstone above his tomb within the cemetery is none other than Daniel Musser. Now, this story is not as long nor colorful as that of the Headless Horseman, but it is interesting. No, this story is simply about a local businessman who lived from the early 1820s until his end in 1888, during which time he was again just a simple businessman who had done nothing exemplary to draw attention to himself and apparently did well financially so as to be afforded to him and his family a rather large and ornate headstone. That is, until he was interred in such location as where the headstone reposed. You see, that's when it happened. When his name was carved into the stone, that is. The, well, issue of the carving is what's at hand. As if carved out of the flesh of man and not the stone of granite where Daniel's name was inscribed, the stone started to do something weird. It began to bleed. And it bled so much as to reach all the way down to the bottom of the stone and across the last name of Musser. It's also stated that within the stone was clearly what looked like a knife, which also had a stain of blood running from the edge of its blade down the face of the stone, which began the rumors of this innocent man being less innocent and more likely a murderer or perhaps even a serial killer. Some stories even claim the knife protruded from the stone and actually dripped blood onto the ground below. But what on earth are we talking about here? Just speculation about what looks like blood on a headstone and the creation of rumors. Well, that is what one would think in general, but if that is all it was, then why did the Musser family replace the stone with the bloodstains? More importantly, why was it that when they changed the stone with the bloodstains, the new stone began to bleed? Even more importantly than that, why did they change the stone yet a second time, only to have the third stone also begin to bleed the same way that the first and second stone bled, leaving them no choice but to clean the stone and mount a consecrated brass plaque over the affected area of the third stone? The source claim to Musser's nefarious deed is that no one knows exactly who was killed, but the consistent portion of the story is that whomever were the victims, they were weary travelers passing through the area, and Musser killed them, taking their money and becoming significantly more wealthy through such deeds. Either way, it's claimed that the stone still bleeds beneath the brass plaque, and eventually even that will give way to the crimes committed by the man beneath the stone. Now for the part that I love the most, the real history. In the story of the Paoli Headless Horseman, the recount of what took place at the Paoli Massacre is, for all intents and purposes, accurate, right down to what was stated by men in their journals of what took place during that battle. That is, except for the one about the wayward or even AWOL soldier. During the Revolutionary War, enlisted men were not permitted to go home or break ranks, even if they were fortified within their very own town, let alone a few miles away. And no, nobody in any right of mind would say it was to save on meek or low rations. I mean, just think about that for a moment. You break camp with even one soldier, and what are the rest of the soldiers going to do? You offer one soldier more food or better food than the others, and the others are going to want that food too. The amount of dissent in ranks would be astounding, where want of food or family would surpass any military discipline trained into these men fighting with their lives for the security of their home. Would you go and move away from your military outpost waiting on an enemy to attack, knowing you were the only chance of keeping those whom you were away from alive and well by stopping the potential of attackers? And who recorded that he was dreaming his socialist friends were being slaughtered by the British? No, I'm sorry. Did I say socialist? Well, that's because this historical society records them as comrades, which is not a phrase used by conservative historians. Only socialist or progressive storytellers who do not seem to realize that even during the time of the Revolutionary War, the French used the term comrade to mean socialists who were above the working class. And well, at this time, we were closely tied to the French. So the use of that word would be to identify dominion over the proletariat or the common working man, and not just used to mean fellow man at arms or brother or battle buddy. So the origin story is just that, a story with nothing but a gory butchering of American soldiers during a reprehensible sneak attack by the British. As for Dr. Bach, Why he decided to feed into the story of the Headless Horseman is beyond me. Perhaps he was getting older, and all the attention that came with his fame was waning, and he just wanted to be remembered for, well, something, anything. And he chose the path of using his accreditations to play one last joke on everybody, or just keep his name alive in the community. Either way, this story was not being retold to anyone more than the children during Dr. Bach's life. And then no one seeing the writer except for him years later, and no one since, would strongly suggest that his whole retelling was a farce that got out of hand. Or perhaps he was just telling it because he had realized how much people had become sheep and would believe any story you told them. Unfortunately, we will never know his reason, but it's quite certain that the mythical Headless Horseman of Paoli is as real as the story told by an author of Dr. Bach's childhood, Washington Irving, and the story of the Galloping Hessian, commonly referred to as the Headless Horseman, but actually titled in the book, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Now let's move over to the bleeding headstone of Musser. This one, although without a lot of meat, is really interesting and actually has some curious foundations in very real history. Daniel Musser truly was an above average local businessman. His business did lie in an area where wandering travelers would have passed through his land on a very regular basis, being that it was essentially one of the only paths going westward through the Allegheny Mountains. As a matter of fact, it still is a prominent corridor to this day, and definitely, at least for a long stretch, not a place you want to break down on the highway because you will have an extremely long wait or an extremely long walk before you find any assistance in any direction. Yeah, we still have a lot of places like that in the real central Pennsylvania. Now, was Daniel a murderer? Well, not according to any legitimate sources. It's more likely that this is a bleed over of the story regarding Schambach or Schambacher Tavern, which we talked about a few weeks ago. Now, why would it bleed over? Well, it turns out a lot of this story regarding Musser and the headstone almost tell you directly. Let's address the bleeding headstone first. When a headstone is made of granite, it's often prepared and then highly polished, which is why people like to buy them with the sales pitch that it will last forever as one of the hardest stones around. And this is accurate, mostly. But granite is also an extremely porous stone. Without being sealed, or in this case, highly polished, granite is prone to sucking up pretty much any wetness you put near it. Even if you have a granite countertop, you better have it polished heavily and then sealed, or a simple ring of coffee at the base of a coffee mug that sat for about 2 or 3 minutes will ensure you have a rather permanent coffee stain in that spot on that forever table. Another thing about granite is that it's full of a lot of different materials. So if you take a polished granite headstone and then carve into it a name, and you don't go back and polish or seal where you carve the name, you expose those minerals to the environment. In this case, it sounds like there was a good amount of iron within the granite, and it was just doing what wet iron and air like to do, which is bleed rust. Another potential is the opening of the stone, exposing the porous cracks to the elements and giving a new home to some sort of mold. You see, in Pennsylvania alone, there's about half a dozen types of mold that readily grow on stone, and yes, many of them are red and bleed red when they're overly wet. You may have seen this in your bathroom at some point in the form of aspergillus, or on old starchy foods like neurospora, and even on plants and different types of high mineral soils with fusarium. This would also explain why the Mussers, after replacing the stone, came back to the exact same bleeding stone results with the new stone, and then again with the third stone, because the entire area would have already been contaminated with this mold. Which brings us back to Daniel being a murderer. As I said before, the opportunity was there, but it was probably a bleed over story of the Schambach history. But what kicked it off for Daniel? Why did it become popular? Well, that is in the story that is commonly told. People who tell the story don't call it the Daniel Musser bleeding headstone. In the story, they say the William Musser bleeding tombstone. Why the difference in names? Well, William Musser was locally known and served time in prison for being a bootlegger. He had a cohort in crime and heir to his property, his nephew Harry. While William was in prison, Harry sold the property to a man named Smith who currently lived on the property and was working the land when William was released. William was furious about this situation and sought legal action against Harry. It would appear, at least at the time, that things were worked out between both William and Harry, and they went about doing business together again. Then on July 19, 1924, William and Harry went out to do some business together. They were seen at Knoll's pool hall at night, and in the morning, William was seen buying some sandwiches for takeout. Maybe I should rephrase that. William was last seen that following morning buying some sandwiches for takeout. It would turn out that Harry, sometime between 4:30 a.m. and 6 a.m., between Nittany and Madisonburg, had shot his Uncle William, once in the side of the neck and once in the head. There's more to the story implicating Harry, but in the end, this coincided with the stories coming out about the Musser family curse and the bleeding headstone of William Musser, which actually refers back to the bleeding headstone of Daniel Musser. I hope you enjoyed these two short ghostly legends that, after some sleuthing, actually turn out to have some part of historical relevance and backing. If you did, give the video a like and let me know. Also, leave me a comment of what you thought about these two stories. Check to make sure that you've subscribed so that you can see the next video's release. And as always, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.